So one of the most important discussions that you're having in the intellectual discourse in the United States today, and it's been going on for about a decade, is the issue of the radical left's takeover of American institutions through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other buzzwords like critical race theory. And these are all very important as Americans wake up and see that their children are being indoctrinated to be transgendered or whatever, and they're trying to figure out how did this happen? Where did this come from? And this discussion is a key discussion that has to be had and has to be had in a major and significant way. And one of the pieces of the discussion that is often overlooked is anti-Zionism. And you see it along with anti-racism, anti-Zionism, anti-this, anti-that, anti-ableism, anti-whatever it is. All of the buzzwords that you're getting. And in a way, you can't really understand, if we want to talk about intersectionality, anti-Zionism is such a key component of the dogma of the radical left today, as we've seen in the anti-Semitic riots, anti-Zionist riots that have been going on all over American institutions since October 7th, that I thought it was important to take a step back from the events of the day and discuss the role of anti-Zionism, where it came from, and how it's really related to the overall cultural transformation of the United States before our eyes by the radical left. And one of the people that I've noticed has been doing very critical work on the study, on the exposition of anti-Zionism and where it comes from and how it plays into the wider drama of the discourse on Israel, on Jews, and Western civilization as a whole, is Izabella Tabarovsky. And Izabella Tabarovsky most recently wrote an article in Tablet magazine, not the first, that's been on this on this general topic called Zombie Anti-Semitism. And after I read it, when I was in the United States this summer, I contacted Izabella and I said, would you please come on my show to talk about this subject? And I was overjoyed when she immediately responded and said, absolutely. So here you are. We meet here in Jerusalem, and I just want to welcome you to the Caroline Glick Show, Izabella.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here.
I mean, you've been doing some very, very important work over the past year or so. I've been reading everything that you've been writing about this subject. A lot of it, for me, is familiar, but it's so important that you're raising these issues now. I talked about it in my book, The Israeli Solution. But you have this article, the latest one that came out July 31st, called Zombie Anti-Semitism.
Anti-Zionism.
Anti-Zionism. See, they're so obviously the same thing that I just mistaken. Anyway, but anti-Zionism is also an alliteration, so that's important. Zombie Anti-Zionism. And then the subheader is the left's addiction to warmed-over Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda from half a century ago proves that this criticism of Israel has nothing to do with the facts on the ground in Gaza. So it came from the Soviet Union. I want you to explain what is it that came from the Soviet Union that we're now seeing popping up all over college campuses, institutions, et cetera, in the United States. Can you just go through a little bit? This is a long article. I read the whole thing, but you don't have to. That's why we brought Izabella here. So can we just spend a few minutes talking about what you found in this article?
Sure, absolutely. And this article, again, I've been writing about this for years, kind of proceeding as I myself was discovering things on my own.
We should just actually tell the audience so that you were born and raised and educated in the Soviet Union.
Right.
You immigrated to the United States like in the 90s? Or
In 1989, we left the USSR with that big wave when Jews were leaving. We landed in the USSR, in the US in 1990. And I then proceeded I just started my education anew, in university and then graduate school, and lived in the U.S. for 30 years, and I've been in Israel for the last few years. And we left, like all Soviet Jews, because of anti-Semitism that existed there. We all experienced it. I experienced it. My family experienced it. We came to the U.S., and I never experienced another day of it for years and for decades, and I forgot about it. And then I think around 2017, 2018, I saw an item on the news where it was a picture of, there's something that we see today all the time, a demonstration, a rally on a campus with placards, Zionism is Nazism, etc. And I was really shocked. Like, it evoked some memories, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. And I called my dad and I told him about it. And I said, this is what they're saying. And I was just confused that this is here on an American campus in the United States. And I said,
Because you had seen it in the Soviet Union.
well, yes, exactly. It had those echoes, but not yet so clearly. It just, what really confused me, I think, is that they were saying we're just being anti-Zionist, we're not being anti-Semitic. Because to me, it was such an obvious anti-Semitic expression that I think that's what confused me. And I told my dad about it. And as soon as I said this line, that they are saying that they are being anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic, he just laughed. And he said, oh, this we've heard before. And that's when the light bulb went off in my head. And I thought, we have heard this before. And then I started re-examining. I went back, I started to re-examine what were our experiences. And I started reading the research that existed then. And what I realized is that all of our anti-Semitism that we experienced occurred under the same lines that were now popping up in left-wing spaces. Right. That Zionists are Nazis, and Israel is a settler colonial state, and Israel is an imperialist state, and Zionism is racism. So all of these lines suddenly were in America. And I started writing about that. And I think I published the first piece maybe in 2019. And I've just been digging in since then. And what this piece is, it's an answer to the question. A lot of times people would ask me, and I give a lot of lectures, and people would say, well, how did this language get to the United States? The USSR is no longer around, right? It dissolved in 1991. Why is it suddenly here? And I had a theory, and I posited it in one of my first major pieces, which I published in Fathom magazine. It's a British excellent publication. Where I said that my theory was that the Western left, simply adopted it from the Soviets already in the 70s and 80s, because the Soviets initiated a massive international anti-Zionist propaganda after 1967. They didn't suddenly turn anti-Zionist. The Soviets were always anti-Zionist, starting with Lenin and Stalin early years. But in 1967, the propaganda went global, and they really developed sort of this overarching...
It's like a new commentary. It was basically...
It was a new stage. A new stage, at that point, after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, they suddenly came to view Zionism as this global enemy, because the defeat of the Soviet ally, Egypt, and other Arab states was so massive and so unexpected that they just simply fell on the familiar pattern of connecting the dots, right, in a kind of paranoid conspiracist way. And there were a number of, we can get into details, but there were a number of developments that happened around the world that made them think that Zionists are everywhere and they control everything. They control America, they control the media. So all of the tropes that we hear in anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, they begin to attribute all of that to Zionism. And the propaganda was massive, and they targeted the Western left, and they targeted the Third World. And so this piece is my explanation of how, and we have other scholars who already documented that as early as 1967, 68, 69, by early 70s, essentially all of the Western left in the UK, in the US, was speaking in this language, in this conspiracist language. And so I think it's very reasonable to ask, well, how is it that all of a sudden they acquired this language? It wasn't part of their lexicon overwhelmingly before that, and it matches perfectly what Moscow was putting out. And so this latest article is my way of documenting how it happened. It's one of the channels. There were other channels, but the Third World channel was really important.
Because I think, what you find... one of the things that I noticed when I was researching my book back in 2013 was that it was Joel Fishman from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs who pointed it out to me, that the actual first time that we had an appearance in an international forum of Zionism as racism and apartheid was in a 1965 forum in the UN in one of the side assemblies there. And the Israeli, so that was before the Six-Day Wars, not about the occupation, right? It was before the Six-Day War, and it was a Soviet resolution that was passed, and the Israeli delegation to the UN was just flummoxed. They were like, "Where on earth did this come from?" They were completely blindsided by it, and that was the first appearance which was later adopted to the Zionism as Racism General Assembly as Resolution 3379 in 1975. that has now just become, since 2001 in Durban, the leitmotif of leftist foreign policy, essentially. Right. So what were the Soviets, and how is it the Soviets did it?
So one of the ways was to, so briefly speaking, before I get to this specific, the topic that I covered in this piece, they used multiple channels. So first of all, they had a massive widespread propaganda apparatus. So they had what they called the Novosti news agency, which was not really a news agency. It was a propaganda channel. It was used as a cover for KGB officers. Novosti journalists were often expelled from Western countries because they were caught spying.
Right.
So they had access to multiple, really to probably 100 countries around the world, with which they also had built extensive relationships. Particularly after Stalin dies, Khrushchev discovers this kind of new rising post-colonial world, the Third World, as it was called then, the non-aligned movement, right. And the Soviets suddenly recognized that they could have, that this could serve as an important platform for promoting their interests in the Third World and defeating the United States non-militarily, right? Just promoting these relationships. So this begins in the 1950s. So by the time you get into the 60s, they already have these relationships on the ground. There are all kinds of friendship societies, which were also centrally directed, also a tool of propaganda. By the way, Mahmoud Abbas served as a president of the Palestinian Soviet Friendship Society. So there is that. There's already a pretty wide network.
And you also had a lot of, like Mahmoud Abbas, Patrice Lumumba, a lot of these third world communist leaders then got their educations at the KGB University in Moscow. And, they became doctors because of the dissertations that they wrote in Moscow.
Exactly. And they didn't even have to be communists. So if you take the ANC, for example, they were essentially all communists. So that's true. And the leadership spent a lot of time in Moscow getting educated. Their children got scholarships to go study in prestigious schools in the USSR, and there were lots of other perks. They would be treated in elite hospitals that only the Kremlin elite had access to, et cetera, et cetera. But, at this point, the Soviets also become much more omnivorous ideologically, because they realize that not everybody in the Third World is willing to go all the way with the communist ideology. So there's a wide variation on Marxism-Leninism that exists, and sometimes they work even with those who are not Marxist-Leninists. Essentially, their main priority at that point is to build an anti-American, anti-Western, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. They begin to use the language that these were real concerns in the Third World, right? Imperialism, colonialism, racism. So the Soviets they were very skilled. Russia today remains the same way. They're very skilled at kind of capturing the zeitgeist and recognizing what will resonate with different audiences. So they begin to build this ecosystem. That's, its players, kind of the constituent elements of that ecosystem, that's what I describe in this latest article, are very different. And in many cases, they wouldn't agree on everything. But the Soviets helped them find kind of the very kind of top line ideas that they all can agree on. So again, anti-American, anti-imperialist, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, and then at some point, anti-racist, of course, it's a big concern at the time. And then when Zionism becomes their ideological priority in 1967, they actually already have kind of a network into which they can infuse their ideas. And they weren't the only ones. Of course, the Arab propaganda had already been promoting anti-Zionism and attacking Israel in all these international bodies.
1958.
And even before that, I would say probably since Israel was established.
Right, but in 1958, you had the establishment of Fatah by Yasser Arafat, and they immediately started making inroads with Nehru and the non-aligned movement.
Exactly.
And they brought themselves into that movement.
Yes.
Right in the late 50s, early 60s as well.
That's exactly right.
And Gamal Abdel Nasser and Nehru were the leaders of the NAM, of the
Precisely.
non-aligned.
Precisely. And Egypt, of course, also had brought in former Nazis, some of whom ran it had an institute, Egypt had an institute whose primary goal was anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli propaganda. So the Soviets also, they absorb all of it, what they do, their power, is that they have this massive reach, right? And they have they throw all these intellectual resources into it. So they essentially draft or draw all these institutes from the Academy of Sciences into kind of synthesizing it and creating principles of how Zionism works and how it is against it. It's all, of course, distorted. It's all
a lie.
It's all a lie. It's a lie. But they read the founders, they read Herzl, they read Ahad, they read Nordau, and they pull out the quotes, which you see now floating on the far left today, still in the same context, that supposedly this quote shows that Zionists were colonialists. Supposedly this quote shows that they were racist. So the Soviets synthesized all of it into one overarching theory of anti-Zionism. And so this is what they do, and they begin to infuse these ideas into the ecosystem, into the Western ecosystem that was already there.
And they did it by essentially conferring prestige on people who embrace this gobbledygook of anti-Zionist, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialism nonsense. And so you lay out here the different conferences that they had, the journals that they had, and their ability to confer this kind of prestige on people who would then go back, get tenured positions at universities, and start just propagating all of this stuff into the intellectual bloodstream of the United States.
Precisely. That's exactly right. So yes, these conferences, they had a certain level of glamour to them. And again, I would say, it's how you position it. So Angela Davis, for example, she owes a lot of her fame. I mean, I can already imagine hate comments coming in. But it's true that she owes a lot of her success, I would say, to Soviet propaganda. There is the Soviets pumped an incredible amount of effort into her propaganda, into propaganda of her image, into elevating her image. That great tour that she did of the socialist countries.
1972.
Yes, exactly. And look, I mean, I've long given up on like trying to pretend that I'm younger than I am, but I want to tell people that I experienced these things firsthand. So I was born in 1970, and I remember in the early 70s, like in the mid 70s, the propaganda of Angela Davis that we all had to be. I think Solzhenitsyn writes about it. We all had to be to support Angela Davis in her struggle. So the campaign was massive, and so. And so
her struggle against racism,
against imperialism, and then once you position her as such, why did the Soviets do it? Because then they can say, this is how the echo chamber works, right? They feed something outwardly, and then when that reflects it back to them, they come and say, well, look, people abroad agree with us. The great communist leader Angela Davis agrees with our position, and they would do the same with lots of, there were American communists, British communists who would, consult with the Soviets. It's actually, we have memos that documented how they would consult with the Soviets on how to present, how to speak about Zionism to their audiences in the West. The Soviets would help them, and then they would go and write articles, and then the Soviets would translate them back into Russian, and they would say, look, these Americans and these Westerners, they say the same thing as we do about Zionism. But of course,
we have the same thing in Israel. I mean, you have these echo chambers all over the place where people work on a global level with like-minded people. They quote one another back to one another, and then they use this already prior coordinated effort as a means to present a unified view that nobody can brook any compromise on or any dissension on, because everybody's already agreed. It's the received wisdom, and everybody already understands that this is correct.
Precisely. You have the system of circular referencing, and the power of it is it looks like, wow, every respected group, right? Every respected human rights.
Everybody who's anybody.
Everybody who's anybody is on the same page as us. And so this is what the Soviets did with the various, independence fighters in the Third World. This is what they did with the ANC, who they all had, a really high status in the eyes, for example, of the New Left in the U.S., right, which rise to prominence with the anti-Vietnam War protests. And so they all look toward the Third World. And so the Soviets helped them once they realized that there's sort of a new cult, right? The New Left supposedly turned away from the USSR, and in many ways they really did. But they're now looking to the Third World. And so the Soviets are like, well, okay, let's elevate that. Let's make it more prestigious. And if you if you are anti-American, anti-imperialist, anti-Western, anti-capitalist, then you should also believe that you have to be anti-Zionist, because Zionism and Israel represent the same kind of evil that the United States and imperialism and racism do.
So there are a couple of things here that I want to sort of pull out of that. One of them is cultural Marxism, because you were talking about how not everybody, that they're omnivores, that they'll go in any direction that actually advances their anti-American agenda, and you see the way that economic Marxism, the normal Marxism that people grew up about, knowing of communism, of economic communism, has been transformed in the West into cultural Marxism, which uses the thing that has glued America together of shared values, of shared history, tears them apart, turns them into things that are evil and have to be hated. And that also includes the capitalist system and its transformation into a socialist system, et cetera. But, I mean, it's a cultural Marxism that's at play here that's a little bit different from what it began with in the Soviet Union, and you also see the advent of that. How did that – so how do I put this question? So I guess as a question. So I guess you're seeing in the 1970s is the time when you see the major leap from normal economic communism into a more cultural overlay of the anti-Western movement. Is that what you would say?
Well, look, I'm very careful always. I'm not an expert on cultural Marxism, so I want to kind of dodge this question a little bit.
Okay.
But what I do want to say is that, yes, the cultural Marxism begins to evolve because the left in the U.S., in the West, begins to realize that the proletariat is not going to accomplish what they always hoped it would accomplish, that it doesn't want a revolution. It wants a better life. And so they begin to place their bet on other groups. And that's the beginning of the evolution of cultural Marxism. What's interesting for me in it, and which is why it's one of the reasons I wrote this article, is that no matter how the left evolves, how the radical left evolves, right? And there are many different strands, right? There's Trotskyists, there are all kinds of left. It's not unified. But no matter which specific direction it takes, when it comes to Israel, it sticks to the same old language that the Soviets proposed to it. So I find it's almost like,
So you're saying, you said it started, you're dating it in this article to 1967. It's really 1949, right, when Stalin started inventing the term of anti-Zionism and using it and distilling it as a new sort of socially acceptable Jew hatred after the Holocaust. So it was the collective Jew that then became the main hated form of Judaism, and it's socially acceptable because it's not the same as Nazi anti-Judaism.
Right, exactly. Well, and if you want to go even further, Stalin wrote an article in 1913 called Nationality, Marxism and the Nationality Question. And there he already describes why Zionists are wrong on everything that socialists stand for. And so Stalin and Lenin, very early on, for various reasons, we can get into it, but, I we don't have time. Yeah. But for theoretical and practical reasons, they essentially stand against Zionism. And when the Soviet Union is established, when the Civil War is over, so some people would say, Lenin was very much against anti-Semitism, but he viewed anti-Semitism as something that only exists in a capitalist society, in a reactionary society. And he claimed that once you have socialism, anti-Semitism will fall away by itself because, everybody's equal, it's internationalist. And Zionists, of course, were nationalists. It's one of the reasons why Lenin and Stalin were against it. But what happens in the 20s is that the first decade of the USSR, some Jews really do well. It's true. All of a sudden, the Pale of Settlement is canceled and all the limitations of Jews are canceled. So they can move up. They can assume all kinds of professions that they want. They can grow. But there are two categories of Jews that remain unacceptable, and that is nationalist Jews, Zionists, and they're all eliminated in this decade. By the way, at the hands, in many cases,
of Jews,
exactly, of the socialist Bund Jews who joined the communists. And and religious Jews. Jews who refuse to give up their religion, they're also persecuted. They go into the underground, okay? But then you're absolutely right that it's with Stalin, and in particularly in Stalin's post-war campaigns, that anti-Zionism emerges as a real, as an ideology. I think it's important to understand, and there's a lot of confusion about it today, that anti-Zionists are not actually arguing against Zionism, because Zionism, they understand Zionism as differently from what it really is, right? Their view of Zionism is what we're discussing, that it's racism, settler colonialism, etc. Anti-Zionism is a standalone ideology that acts on it has its own kind of worldview, and it lives within it, and it perpetuates it. And so it begins to emerge as an ideology under late Stalin. You're correct. That is when, there's a big anti-Semitic campaign against Jews, and this is when you begin to hear accusations of Zionism and being servile or serving the interests of Israel begin to appear. And of course, it's not an accident that that's when it happens, because then Israel is established. Mm-hmm. Stalin first supported it, but that lasted very briefly. As soon as Israel shows that it's not going to follow Stalinist Soviet footsteps, that ends. And when Golda Meir first comes to visit the USSR in 1948, the Soviet Jews are really ecstatic, and they want to embrace her. And that's when really it begins. Stalin's paranoia gets set off. But so what happens under Stalin is that that anti-Zionism remains essentially within the USSR and within the Soviet bloc. There is a trial against
the Hungarians
in 1956. That's already after Stalin. But in the Czech Republic, there is a trial, the Prague trial, against loyal Czech communists, who, by the way, were anti-Zionists, but they're accused of being Zionist, and they are hanged, which, by the way, sets off a massive anti-Semitic campaign. And when I give talks, I always point out to people, look, if there is, as you say, or as many people say, supposedly there is a separation or clear line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, then why is it that an anti-Zionist trial sets off a wave of anti-Semitism, right? So then things continue under Khrushchev. My divisions here are kind of notional, but really the next big stage, I think, happens in '67, which is that's when they go global. That's what makes it different, and that's when they really, develop a massive.
When you say
theory.
It's a standalone, that brings me to another thing, which is the Metrokin archive. So. Christopher Andrew and Vasily Metrokin, they write a companion piece to the first Metrokin archive, which is called "The World Was Going Our Way," and it's about the Soviet influence campaigns in the Third World. And there, anti-Zionism figures in a major way in the Soviet efforts to subvert American power in the world. And what they explain is that their idea was that you can break American power by undermining Americans' own sense of the morality of the United States of America, and that anti-Zionism and subversion of Israel in the West was a central aspect of their efforts to undermine America's moral sense of itself as an agent of good in the world, that they viewed specifically anti-Zionism as a new form of anti-Semitism that was culturally acceptable, etc. That was it was in a way even the most powerful form of anti-Americanism. Do you see that? And if you do, how do you see that manifesting itself?
Well, look, I think that what's really important.
And I guess that it speaks also to what you were saying about it being a standalone ideology.
Yes, exactly. Well, when you read that book, which I think is absolutely incredible, an absolutely incredible documentation of what was going on during the Cold War, what you really understand is that a lot of the individuals who it's customary to view as heroes of national liberation movements, in fact, were acting with support and training and financing from the USSR. And not only the USSR, I mean, it's also, once you start looking at who was doing what in Moscow, it's really essentially one or two agencies that are involved. It's the same agencies. So the KGB, of course, which is what Mitrokhin writes about, and the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the USSR. So the International Department is really important. It's essentially a continuation of the Comintern, which was established early on. And it's basically, so you have different people who are responsible for different countries, but essentially it all emanates from the same place, right? The same person, Ponomarev, is overseeing all of it. And the anti-Zionism emanates from that structure as well. So there was an official in that structure, senior official, who ran the so-called Milovanov Club. Milovanov was his last name. The club was about 12.5 of people that were called Zionologists. So people who supposedly knew and understood Zionism. They all had connections with the KGB, with the security services. They all found perches at various academic institutions that were all complicit, or that were all part of this campaign, but used these outward positions to create more influence. And so you can see that it was centrally planned, truly, and from there, then, it's a centrally controlled media apparatus. And so once they put out certain ideas, then everybody else picks them up, and it begins to spread through different networks. And sometimes, sometimes they would send the same article. They would republish it numerous times for different audiences. They adjusted them to different audiences. So, for African countries, for example, and I touch on that in this piece, they would skew it specifically to claim that, to emphasize that Israel is like an apartheid South Africa. And that already appears in 1967. We think it's new. It actually already appears in the 50s, but in the 60s is when it becomes really widespread. And they would talk about genocide already also in 67. So then for Europeans who have a stronger memory of Nazi Germany and World War II, they would be more heavily equating Zionists with Nazi Germany. So you see that kind of really centralized approach to the spreading of this propaganda and ideology.
Why do they do that? Why do they care so much about the Jews? What is it that, why would they care? In the 1960s, Israel was barely 2 million people.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. And I think that's another thing that you see from Mitrokhin's article, and it's something that I've also understood already from Mitrokhin's and Andrew's book, and something that I began to understand already years ago. There were foreign policy interests, there were domestic interests. So on the foreign policy front, they saw, again, that Israel had lost in the Six-Day War. It was a massive...
Won in the Six-Day War.
Oh, had won in the... apologies. It had won in the Six-Day War, and it was a massive traumatic event for them in Moscow, which made them think, they couldn't understand how this little country, as you say, with 2 million people, had won over Soviet Arab allies who they trained and financed and equipped. And so they begin to think that there must be forces that are bigger than Israel that are operating here. And this is when it gets tied with internal interests, because domestically, Soviet Jews are awakened by Israel's victory in 1967. And they're beginning to agitate for emigration. This is when you have the Refuseniks movement. And the Refuseniks are supported by a movement across the world, right? The Soviet Jewry movement in the US, in the UK, in Australia, also in Israel. And so, again, the Soviets, it's important to understand when you're in a totalitarian state is always inclined toward conspiracist thinking. And certainly Soviet political culture was very conspiracist. And the people who were in power in the late 60s, early 70s were Stalinists. Many of them came out of, this is post-Khrushchev reform era. So many of them came of age professionally during Stalin. So they're already naturally thinking in those terms. And so they feel that, well, surely somebody is coordinating. Somebody is telling our Soviet Jews inside the country to agitate against us. It's a very threatening movement for them because a lot of people forget today, but you couldn't emigrate from the USSR. And if they are afraid that if they allow one group to emigrate,
everybody will want to run away.
Everybody will want to go. And so they see it as a threat to internal stability and security. They are sure that external forces are involved. This is also a pretty consistent thought in kind of Soviet Russian foreign policy. Today, Putin today is also, it's an extreme kind of concern also that some external forces are trying to undermine the country from inside. So there are political motivations here, which I think is important to understand, because a lot of times we talk about anti-Semitism as prejudice, as hatred of Jews. You know, there were definitely people inside the Soviet apparatus who hated Jews. Among the Zionologists is documented. They actually, in fact, even though they were working for a far-left empire and couching their ideas in far-left language, they themselves held far-right views, kind of, you know, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist views, which came to full expression during the perestroika. But what you see in the Soviet case is that it's not necessarily just prejudice. There were people inside these circles for whom it was a career opportunity. There were people who sincerely believed in the conspiracy, that there was a Zionist conspiracy operating against Soviet interests. There were people who were working for the security of the state. They simply believed, just like anti-Semites sincerely believe, that there is an anti-Semitic conspiracy, that the Jews are in a conspiracy against the rest of the world, right? They believe that Zionists are in a conspiracy to undermine the Soviet Union and socialism and communism and Soviet interests.
All right. You said that was internally and externally. You said that there were two aspects to the centrality of anti-Zionism as a standalone. So the internal is the dynamics are afraid of being destabilized. What's the external one?
The external is foreign policy interests, the Middle East. They feel that they've lost hold somehow of the Middle East because what they think is that it's Americans who are supporting and directing Israel. Of course, in '67, Americans were not
supporting.
They were not here, exactly. But they are certain that that's what's going on. And also, they have a very strong relationship with the Arab states, and they are very much, they want to support them. There is Arab lobbying kind of directed at the USSR. They're saying, you need to help us. All these Jews who are emigrating to Israel end up in uniform fighting against Palestinians. So there is a unity of interest also with the Arab countries. And then there is a perception that, remember that at some point, there is a short period called the détente, right? When it's sort of like a desire to have a peaceful relationship with the U.S. And they feel that Zionists are preventing them from doing it.
With the Jackson-Vanik Amendment.
The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, exactly. And they look...
Which required the Soviets to allow the immigration of Soviet Jewry.
Precisely, exactly. And so there's a fascinating correspondence in 1970 between the Soviet ambassador to Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin, and his superiors in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they are talking about his superiors are telling him, look, we know that there is a lot of Zionist influence. And he actually tells them, look, there are Jews everywhere. There are Jews, they're in all the influential places, and they're all Zionists. So, and he's also, we have to understand, he's a Soviet bureaucrat. He's playing into the mood that's in the USSR, right? So he's reporting all of it to them. And they write back and they say, yes, so you have to fight against it. Go meet with congressmen on the Hill and explain to them how dangerous Zionism is. Establish relationships with progressive Jewish organizations. Explain to them, create a split between anti-Zionist Jews and Zionist Jews. Create a split between non-Jews and Jews. Tell them that Zionists are preventing preventing the establishment of a good relationship between the U.S. and the USSR, and therefore basically threatening world peace.
And between the U.S. and the Arabs as well, or
the U.S. and Arabs, that I'm not sure, but probably. There is a brochure that they put out called Washington and Israel Against the Arabs, something like that. So they believe that, yes, absolutely, Zionists are inciting against the Arab states in the United States.
Well, because those are the arguments that you find in the Israel Lobby by Walton Mearsheimer from 2007. Those are the arguments that you see on campuses today.
Right.
against Israel and how Israel is destabilizing, and Israel, of course, is the oppressor. And so the oppressor mem also of Israel was also related to the United States. I mean, just today, Iran said, or Hamas, whatever, both of them, said that they don't really think that you can have a ceasefire because the United States can't be trusted because they're with the Zionists, or so that any modicum of American support for Israel is taken to mean that the United States and Israel are equal, are two sides of the same coin, and that you can't separate them. And here, it brings me to the last sort of slice of this discussion that I want to have, and we could go on for hours, but just to sort of give a sense of this story, of this extremely important story about the way that what we're seeing today on the campuses and really in the boardrooms of the United States against Israel, against Jews who support Israel in the United States, came about is, you have this discourse, as I said in the outset, about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI industry, the critical race theory industry, and how they've marched through American institutions. So one of the people who's been fighting this, most prominently in the United States in recent years is a researcher named Christopher Rufo, and he just wrote a book called America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. And I think, and I just started reading it. I picked it up when I was in America. And and he goes through, the race and the inequality and the this and the that. And he talks about the four founding fathers of the leftist transformation of the United States as Angela Davis, Herbert Marcuse, Paulo Freire, and Derek Bell. And I think that the conversation is incomplete because at the same time as you had the George Floyd riots and the BLM riots, and you have the free immigration, no borders, and just the white supremacist mem that's coming out, the sexism mem, or whatever you want to, sexualization of everything in the United States, and the advocacy of transgenderism, an LGBTQ agenda everywhere. You also have a foreign policy piece of that, which is anti-Zionism. Like you don't see, there's a little pro-Ukraine against Russia, but that's much less tangible on a daily basis than anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism has become the anti-Vietnam movement, the anti-Contras movement, or the big thing that people on the left, on the far left, are fighting, and now the central yet left are fighting, is Zionism, is Israel, so that it's become the foreign policy of the same radical left that's fighting in that's taken over the institutions. And so, if you can just sort of comment on the role that anti-Zionism is playing in this ecosystem of radical leftism and their tearing apart of the American society.
Well, look, I think, first of all, I want to say that today's rhetoric is actually even more radical than we saw in the USSR. In what way? Because in the USSR, in Soviet times, when the Soviets kind of oversaw this whole ecosystem, which, they didn't control, I just want to be clear, they simply gave people in this ecosystem what they wanted, and then they provided, because they had the financial muscle, they had the organizational muscle, this is before the internet, they could bring people together and kind of help to infuse and create kind of a sense of shared ideas and shared terminology, right? So this is the important part here. But the Soviets were very careful in their diplomacy to say that they believe that Israel has a right to exist. And I think that even as they financed groups and states that wanted to annihilate Israel, right? So there are two sides here. So covertly, they're financing those who want to annihilate Israel, but overtly...
By the way, that's what the EU is doing today. They're funding all of these NGOs that are operating, and the Palestinian Authority, whose goal is the annihilation of Israel. and yet they're saying we're Israel's allies.
And Israel has a right to defend itself, etc. Exactly. So all of this lip service exists in Soviet times. I think the Soviets also insisted on Israel's right to exist because they understood if they said something else, then they would be accused of anti-Semitism. And of course, their victory over Nazism is such an important part of their kind of self-perception and projection to the world that they can't. That if they said that Israel has no right to exist, then they would be like the Nazis. So what they say is something that we already hear said today, is that we believe that Israel has a right to exist, but that it needs to be de-Zionized. It needs to be rid of its Zionist rulers, and the people of Israel need to become free. And so
that's Rashida Tlaib's one state.
Exactly. But what we see also today is people saying openly that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Right. And I think that this is, as I said to somebody on another program recently, this is basically the radical left without Soviet supervision. They're no longer afraid to say whatever they want. And then the whole, this little chant from the river to the sea, Palestine. I mean, that's also new. You don't have that in Soviet literature. My understanding is that it comes from Hamas. It's a translation from essentially.
We had that at Columbia when I was an undergraduate there in the late 80s.
Okay, yeah. So that's okay. So let's give them credit. That's one new addition. But everything else, I mean, look, if you look at the left's, at what the far left was writing in 1982, and this is something, as you mentioned, this latest piece is very long. I had another 1,000 words there where I wrote about what happened during the Lebanon War of 1982. By then, these ideas got so firmly established already on the Western left that by 82, they're all speaking in one voice against Israel. Israel is conducting a genocide. Israel is an apartheid state. All of that is already there, and it's baked into it. And so my view is that, in this piece, I go through some of the figures that have been influential in formulating the contemporary discourse, including with regards to foreign policy. Whether you take the British, Jeremy Corbyn and his advisors, or on our own, on American side, Robert Malley, they all come out of that ecosystem, that third worldist ecosystem, where these ideas became firmly embedded already in the 70s and 80s. And so I think that what we see, the reason why this all exploded and everybody was suddenly speaking in the same voice already on October 7th and certainly on October 8th is because it was already there. It had been inculcated for decades. It was part of the left-wing sensibility, including these ideas that have to do with foreign policy, that the West needs to stop financing or supporting Israel, that we need to, whatever they're all saying, like it all is already there for decades.
I would just add to that one insight that, I've gotten over the years, and it's shared, I know, by my colleague David Wormser, is that, when you look at, and in a way, anyway, I was going to say the Wall Street Journal columnist who wrote the book about American support for Israel over the years, his name suddenly escapes me, which is totally embarrassing because Walter Russell Mead also kind of, he resonates this in his book, which is that, the United States is predicated on the Bible and on the idea that the United States is sort of the new Israel, the new promised land, and American psyche and ethos is based on a biblical interpretation of the land of the free and being a light to the nations, that the United States, through its freedom and liberty, was going to be a light unto the nations, so that they saw themselves very much not in a way that that replaces Israel. It's not replacement theology, but replicates what they admired in the people of Israel, that they were going to build a new Jerusalem in the new world. And so the idea of de-Judaizing American society and saying that the story of the Jewish people and the land of Israel is a lie, and it's a colonialist implant, it's foreign, it's got nothing to do with the natives of the land, so too the United States, that was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that too was actually formed in the original sin of slavery, that if you take away the morality of the Jewish people and of Zionism and of the of the state of Israel, then that also undermines, erases, or assists in erasing the moral justification for American exceptionalism, for American power, for American freedom and liberty. Because if both of them are a lie and a myth of a colonialist, imperialist, ulterior motives, then neither of them are any good. And both of them have to be, in the words of Obama, fundamentally transformed. And so you're seeing the same kind of subversion that you're seeing walk in the march through the American institutions of the anti-racist theologians, or whatever you want to call them, theoreticians. You're seeing the same thing with the anti-Zionism, and they are here as well, two sides of the same coin, the great Satan and the little Satan, and that's why it's been so fundamental to the ultimate undoing of the United States to also undo America's support for understanding of identification with the Jews, the Jewish state, the old Zion, and the original Jerusalem. So I think that here, too, you're seeing something fundamental, that the Soviets, maybe in their conspiracy mindset, that it was partially informed by their atheism, that, if you're looking at 67, you're saying, how in the hell did that happen? So a person with a religious mindset would come away from that and say it's because God intervened on behalf of the Jews. And since you don't want to accept the notion that such a thing exists because there is no deity, then you come away with a conspiracy theory about anti-Zionism. And that provides you with the explanation that you need for something that doesn't seem natural.
Well, that's a really good point, and it made me think. It reminded.
Sorry for the diatribe in the middle of your interview.
No, that's no. It's always better when it's an exchange. But the thing what came to my mind as you were talking is this is one of the reasons why one of the fundamental stories on the anti-Zionist left is the idea of the Zionist and Nazi collaboration. This is, like in the secular world, nothing can undermine an ideology more than comparing it or equating it with Nazism. And this, again, it begins in Soviet times because the Soviets are a secular state, as you say. In classical anti-Semitism, they equate the Jew with the devil. The Soviets can't do it. They equate the Zionists with the closest thing to the devil, which is Nazis, because they understood the power of the Jewish story. They understood the power of the Zionist story, the power of the Holocaust, and what that meant for the Jewish people. And so they work really hard and really insistently to undermine all of these stories. And one of the ways through which they do it is by claiming that Zionists collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust. I mean, this is often omitted. People often don't realize it. Didn't just collaborate, but collaborated specifically in the Holocaust. And this is actually a borrowing from the right-wing myth, the far-right myth of the fact that Jews perpetrated the Holocaust against themselves, right? It's the neo-Nazi myth. So this...
And also the Arab myth. I mean, that was Mahmoud Abbas's doctrine, which you also discussed in one of your previous articles.
Precisely, which he defended in the USSR under the influence of Soviet propagandists. So they essentially fed him these ideas, because I examined the sources of his so-called dissertation. It's really a pamphlet in size. It's all of these Zionologists whose dedication was to smear Zionism. So yes.
So the idea is that they want to remove the inspirational aspect, the moral aspect of the ingathering of Jewish exiles in the land of Israel. And they do this by just demonizing it in the worst possible way.
Exactly.
In contemporary lingo.
Exactly. And another thing that you see in Soviet anti-Zionist literature, and also today's far left repeats the same idea as well, is they latch on to the biblical notion of Jews as a chosen people. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, Zionists claim that they're the chosen people, and that's why they have a right to the Palestinian lands. And so it's, of course, a complete distortion, and putting on the head of the idea of chosenness. But this is, but this is what you see. And again, it comes from neo-Nazis, really. It comes from neo-Nazi thought. And one of the most striking things about contemporary far-left discourse, and again, it already appears in the 70s and 80s, is the extent to which they reproduce neo-Nazi and white supremacist tropes with left-wing language, to the extent where sometimes you can distinguish the two.
Well, that, of course, I guess this should be the end of it, but I mean, that's, of course, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, they all swam together in the same fetid ocean of hatred and genocide. So, I mean, it's not surprising. Everybody acts like they're polar opposites, the National Socialists and the Socialists, but they were birds of a feather, and they flocked together as long as they could, as long as it was mutually advantageous, and then they, went to war against each other. But I think, the point here is that, it's a fetid swamp that's sort of, it's got a lot of crap inside of it, and a lot of really lousy ideas that keep regurgitating themselves. So the first ones who said it were the Nazis, the second ones who said it were the Marxists, or the other way around. It doesn't really matter. It's all the kind of the same muck.
Precisely. And I think that one of the things that we really need to understand, and what, I'm often asked, why? Okay, well, now we know that it came from the USSR. First of all, why is it important?
Right.
We are fighting, the USSR is not there anymore. We're fighting something today. Why should I know? Or now that I know, what's the point? And I always say, look, Nazi Germany is not there anymore, right? But we study its history. We understand that much of anti-Semitic hate today is driven by ideas that were created in Nazi Germany. So it's really, and we recognize these ideas. When we encounter them, we're able to trace them to their origin, and that helps us to immediately put these ideas outside normal political discourse. We are incapable of doing that with far-left anti-Semitism. And I think that the first thing we need to do is to learn to identify these ideas. I mean, me and the other Jews who came out of the USSR, we just want to hit our head against the wall when we see people trying to engage in good faith with these ideas that Zionism is racism, Zionism is colonialism. It's propaganda. It was created as propaganda. It's not a good faith argument. And there are no scholars that have succeeded at proving it, without twisting things just horribly. So I think the first thing is to learn this. Now, somebody just said to me, who teaches in school, in high schools, Naya Lecht, you may know her. So she has said it publicly. So I'm not I feel okay with quoting her, but that when she teaches this to her students, they don't even understand what is the problem with the Soviet Union. Like when you tell them that this came out of the USSR, they don't know really anything about the Soviet Union to be able to understand the
I think that partly is a function of the fact that, you had all of these tenured professors who marinated in Soviet propaganda as grad students who are now, they blocked any real moral reckoning for the Soviet Union in the Western world. They collapsed and, now let's be friends. What did George H.W. Bush famously say? Well, it's chicken Kiev. We don't actually want the Soviet Union to break apart. We liked it when we had a bipolar world. And so there's never been the way that you've had a moral reckoning is with Nazism and with supporters of Nazism after the Second World War. You never had that with Soviet fellow travelers.
Precisely.
Never had that in the United States.
Precisely. And I think that a lot of, we know that the academics primarily leftists. Why would they reckon with this issue? They
support it.
They supported it, and they view themselves as standing up to American power by being so leftist. But they don't understand that they're actually just being they're all in agreement. There's a consensus. There's nothing dissident about what they're saying. It's actually the opposite. So yes.
Well, we'll have to see what happens. But I think what we see really is that the threat to Western civilization is 360 degrees, and that the anti-Semitism aspect to it, expressed through anti-Zionist propaganda, you tackle this again in the intersectional sort of mindset, then that also moves you forward with the other aspects of their chokehold on the American mind and on through the American institutions, and therefore the fight against anti-Semitism in the West is a critical aspect of the fight for the West.
Right.
And I think that your scholarship on this issue is playing a very important role in raising this up again into the consciousness, and I wanted to amplify it in this conversation, and I think we did a pretty good job. So
I think we did. Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to just say what a pleasure it is to have you on the show. We're going to have you back again to talk about this again, because this is a big thing. And guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again very soon. Take care.